Awesome. Well, welcome today. Is everybody having a good LastCon so far? Yes. Awesome. Good. Curious, we saw in the opening keynote, but how many of you guys are new to LastCon? Handful? Okay, cool. So I founded LastCon way back in 2010 with my buddy James Wickett. This conference has been running all the way since then. We've only had one COVID year, where we missed this conference. So for everybody who's new, welcome to the conference. For everybody who's back, thank you all for your support. We truly do appreciate it. For those who don't know me, I'm Josh Sokol. I am CISSP. I spent 10 years running the information security team at National Instruments. I founded this business called SimpleRisk back in 2013 because spreadsheet-based risk management sucks, and all the GRC tools out there were too expensive for me. And then I founded LastCon in 2010 because the local conferences sucked and they were too expensive for me. I used to be on the OWASP board a long time ago, and I guess my specialties are organizational governance, risk management, and compliance, secure application development lifecycle, and I'm sure you guys can relate to this, banging my head against the wall, asking people over and over to do things, not having them done right or not at all. By the way, does anybody else have kids? Yeah, okay. So in any case, I bet you're wondering who this guy is next to me, so we're going to talk about our motivation for this talk instead. Way back when, I wanted to be able to take credit for all the things that we were doing right with my SimpleRisk organization. I wanted to be able to do things quickly and efficiently to identify areas for improvement. We wanted to provide a tool to do this, so we should be eating our own dog food. And our customers were asking us for third-party attestation. And so essentially what happened was this very large healthcare company came to us. And they said, hey, this SimpleRisk thing is really cool. We could use this thing, and we could use this for consulting with all of these other organizations that we're working with on a daily basis. And they wanted to do a huge deal with us, a multi-year deal, and they wanted custom development to do FAIR in SimpleRisk and all this other stuff. And I was like, okay, cool, this sounds awesome, right? Great opportunity, we're gonna make some good money from this thing. And initially they came to us with this supplier information risk assessment. You guys have gotten these, I'm sure. It's like the supplier, the company who's like thinking about your product, and they go, hey, we want you to answer a few questions. Make sure you're secure. I'm like, cool. So it looked something like this. It was from the procurement department. There were like 13 questions. They were all yes, no answers. And I'm like, no big deal, right? This is procurement. And then they came back to us and they said, hey, we'd also like to see your SOC 2 attestation or your ISO 27001 certification, which we didn't have. And I was like, sorry, we don't have this thing. We don't have the certification, but here's a bunch of documentation, right? We do things securely. We're good, right? Trust me. And they were like, yeah, we'll trust you, but also we have this really long documentation-oriented thing that we need you to fill out now because you don't have this attestation or this certification. And this was longer. It had 25 domains, not questions, domains. They wanted screenshots, evidence of everything that we were doing, and then they wanted detailed process descriptions. So basically they wanted us to do an ISO 27001 audit for them that we wouldn't get credit for ISO, right? And oh, by the way, this isn't a one-shot deal. Like I could probably swing this if it was one time, but they wanted us to do this every year. And I was like, all right. So I sent them this standard response, right? Hey, I totally understand that this is a security thing. I'm with you, man. I'm a security practitioner. I've been doing security a long time. Let me send you some documentation to help you be really comfortable over our controls. And so we have a SIG-like questionnaire. We've got our information security policy. We have our incident management plan. All the things that you would expect from a really good company that's doing things securely. But they held firm. They said, hey man, you don't have a SOC 2, you don't have ISO 27001, we need the evidence. But my struggle was, I'm the CEO of the company, I do all the sales calls, I'm also one of the architects of the infrastructure. I'm the monkey guy, right? Like I do everything. And I was like, I can't justify the opportunity cost, the time that I'm gonna spend to fill out this enormous questionnaire to give them what they want, even though this was a huge opportunity and nobody else in my organization could do it. And so I told them, I said straight up, look, I'm sorry we can't do this. Is there another way? Like, we'll give you our documentation. We do third-party pen tests. Like, we're doing things well. And I got this back. It said, this email is to notify you that we will not pursue a contractual relationship with us going forward. They're going down a different path. And so I did what I normally do in these situations, and I cried a little bit. We lost a prospective customer, which sucks. And I did the other thing that I normally do in this situation, which is go have a drink. And the what ifs were killing me on this one, right? I was like, well, what if we did this? What if we did this? How could things be differently? And so after some drinking and thinking, I decided to write an email to our stakeholders. I was like, hey man, this is really disappointing, given all the amount of time we've all invested in this, but I got a question for you. If we had that certification, if we were ISO certified, if we had a SOC 2, whatever, would that have made a difference? So if we had all these requirements, we were able to demonstrate compliance, if we had third-party validating our compliance, would this have ended differently? And the answer was yeah. Hey, if you had changed your ways, if you guys had a certification or an attestation, yeah, it wouldn't have mattered. We would have been able to go forward with you guys. But I got this email. So this is a little bit out of order, but yeah, you said, hey, if you have these things, you wouldn't have to do this risk assessment, whatever. But this email came, and I highlighted the bottom part. It was this guy who was kind of our stakeholder on this project, and he said, I really like your product. Good thing I don't live in Austin. You might have had to hire me. It's like, oh, that's interesting. So I had my answer on the stuff, but I sent him a message back, and I was like, hey, you don't have to live in Austin to work for Simplerisk. You've got employees all over the world. Maybe you'd like to be the one that gets it certified. Why not, right? And I got a response back like a few minutes later, and it was like, hey, switch this to my personal email for conversation. Senior Director of Security and Compliance at Simplerisk has a nice ring to it. I've attached my resume. And so, long story short, we didn't get the sale, but we did win over the stakeholder, which was pretty awesome. And I subsequently offered him the job of Chief Compliance Officer with the mission of getting us certified, and he accepted. So, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce Alan Proctor, Chief Compliance Officer of Simplerisk.
So as you all know, I previously worked at a Fortune 20 healthcare company. As you all know, I previously worked at a Fortune 20 healthcare company the last 7.5 years. By the way, this is my first presentation on stage like this, so cut me a little slack. During that 7.5 years, I basically had 3 tours of duty. I originally led a team of 16 that performed PCI, high trust, and SOC 2 assessments. I then led a team of 5 that built an anti-fraud product suite for their internal HSA bank. And then lastly, before I came to Simplerisk, I led their GRC program development for external healthcare clients. Prior to that, I worked for SunGuard as a QSA doing PCI assessments and RUCs, and also doing ISO 27001 and 002 assessments, not audits. Basically, the client would ask us to come in and do a pre-assessment to make sure they were ready for their annual audit. Several years ago, I had an interview question that I never had before, which was, Alan, tell me what's not on your resume. I had to think for a second. I said, well, as an employee and a consultant, over my 30-year career, I've been with about in and out of 50 different companies across industry verticals, except the government sector, because it just scares me. So no one has ever accused me of not having an agenda, so here you go for that.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about architecture. 1,000 miles begins with just one step. So this is the LAMP stack. This is what Simplerisk was based on. Ubuntu Linux under the hood, Apache, MySQL, and then PHP. And I put a slide. I've given lots of presentations in the past where I've talked about architecture and things like that. And people always look at the PHP thing and they're like, PHP is insecure. And I'm like, no, it's not. It all depends on who is writing in PHP. And actually, White Hat did a study many years ago about that, and they concluded that it's all about the developers and how well the developers are trained, not about the language itself. All languages are inherently insecure unless somebody who knows how to write them writes them. Hence why you are all here at the OWASP conference. So a little bit more about the architecture. We have a couple different platforms, but Kubernetes orchestration with Docker containers, that's essentially our trial tier for smaller customers, things like that, because it scales really well. And then we have another platform that uses dedicated AWS environments. So think virtual private clouds, elastic compute servers, relational databases, and elastic load balancers for those customers, each environment dedicated to the customer. And then we use some things like Chef and CloudFormation script for the provisioning and deprovisioning of these environments. And the reason why I wanted to make sure that we kind of touched on this is because we're going to talk about compliance, and obviously compliance is going to change depending on the architecture that you guys are using. So let's talk frameworks. I talk to people about frameworks every day. Literally the first question we ask customers when we hop on a call with them is, what frameworks are you guys using? And we get a lot of different answers. We get NIST CSF, we're using CIS critical security controls, high trust, PCI DSS, GDPR from the privacy side. And it kind of feels a little bit like this like Royal Rumble, right? WWE, WWF if you're old school. When it comes to certification or attestation, which is our ultimate goal here, it really comes down to two main ones. You have SOC 2, which is the Hulk Hogan, and you have ISO 27001, which is your Macho Man Randy Savage, right? Those are the two big ones that are out there. And so when you're looking at SOC 2, you have a few pros. It's adaptable. SOC 2 is usually based on another certification. So you're saying, okay, well, we're going to use this as kind of the basis, and then we're going to say these are the things that we need to adhere to. And so you can kind of pick and choose. It does indicate advanced information security because you're able to say, hey, we do have a framework, we are doing these things, and ensures responsible handling of sensitive information, which is really why these customers want it, is they want to be able to place their trust in us and be able to put their sensitive data in our environment. But the cons here is it's mostly US based. You don't see a lot of SOC 2 outside the US. And the really big one for a small organization is it can be over $250,000 for attestation. So that is a huge showstopper for us, right? We're a small organization. On the flip side, you have something like ISO 27001. The pros here is it's international. ISO by definition is an international standards organization. And so you have organizations literally all over the world that are looking at ISO compliance. It assures a fully operational security framework, where with SOC 2, they can kind of pick and choose which controls apply to their organization. With ISO, you do it or you don't, right? And so if you're ISO compliant, you're saying, we do ISO. There is no in between, there's no gray area. It includes both legal and regulatory compliance in there, and the actual law is somewhere around $20,000. Might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less based on the size of your organization, but that's probably about right. So it's an order of magnitude less than the other one. The con here is that it's significantly more extensive. There's a lot more that you have to do, whereas with SOC 2, I can say, well, we don't do that, so let's just push that control out. Side note, if you are ever trying to work with an organization and they say, we're not ISO 27K, but we are SOC 2, look at the SOC 2, figure out which controls apply to that organization, because if they've pulled out certain controls, you can use that to figure out what things they're not doing. And I'd be way more concerned about those things. In any case, the nice thing here is that this is adaptable. So for us, we can kind of scope out what we don't want via that statement of applicability. And so SOC 2 tends to be very subjective. ISO is more objective. So the question comes up, why can't we do both? And realistically, you could do both. There's a lot of organizations like AWS as an example that do both. And oftentimes when you're working with customers, they're going to want to know how you compare to their framework. So maybe they're not using SOC 2 or they're not using ISO, they're using CIS or whatever. And the questions that they're going to ask aren't based on ISO, they're based on CIS. So you can try to do it all. You could be like Amazon and have your SOC 2 and have your ISO and whatever. But you're going to really quickly suffer from audit fatigue, because every single one of these frameworks is going to require you to go through that set of controls and say we pass, we fail, maturity, whatever, for each of those different frameworks. So you quickly suffer from this audit fatigue. What if you could do them both in a way that you don't suffer from audit fatigue? And so enter what's called the secure controls framework into the mix. I'll go on record and say I'm a big SCF fanboy. I've been using it for many years. I recommend it to a lot of customers. The cool thing is it's free. You can go to securecontrolsframework.com right now. You can download the spreadsheet, and you can use the Secure Controls Framework. This is a common control framework. So if you've ever heard of UCF, Unified Compliance Framework, it's kind of similar to that. UCF is going to argue that they use all sorts of cool word language mapping, whatever, to do theirs, whereas SCF doesn't. But the reality is they're probably equally as good, but this one is free and the other one's not. So from the common control framework approach, we have over 1,000 security and privacy related controls. Actually, I think now it's up to almost 1,200. And these are mapped across over 200 different frameworks, including SOC 2 and ISO 27K. So the two frameworks that we're targeting here are already a part of the secure controls framework. Why is this important? Well, when we start to look at this, and that's a little small, but what essentially happens with this SCF spreadsheet is you have a domain, you have a control number, and then you have the actual control description. In this case, it's mechanisms exist to facilitate the implementation of cybersecurity and data protection governance controls. But the cool thing is you see all the mappings that are associated with this control. So if you look at those two orange columns there, I hid every other 200 columns from all the other frameworks because these are the two that we're looking at, but they're all there. So if you want to look at CIS, if you want to look at NIST CSF, whatever, they are there. So for us, we're trying to demonstrate compliance with SOC 2, with ISO, but we can show how we comply with SOC 2 even though we're certified with ISO through this methodology. And you can see the mappings here. So for SOC 2, this is CC 1.2, but for ISO, it maps to all these different controls. We'll talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of this in a second. So when it comes to doing both, we actually can do both. So you end up with a bit of word salad here, and this is probably the biggest struggle with this approach. So if we look at Gov01, which is control in the secure controls framework, it says we have mechanisms for cybersecurity and data protection governance. If we look at CC 1.2 in our SOC 2, which was the one that this maps to, it says you have change control and authorization, documentation, testing, and rollback. So you can kind of see how they're similar, right? Because those are different ways to say governance, but you can also see how it's different. When we look at ISO 27K 4.4, that control there, it says organizations need to establish and implement procedures to ensure that information systems undergo a formal acceptance process before they are put into production or operation. So again, we're talking about governance, same idea here, but this is a little bit more specific. So we end up with a bit of this word salad. There's a lot of words here, different meanings, and we need to ensure that these things mean the same thing. And Alan will talk a little bit more about kind of how we do that approach, but realistically we have to be able to say, even though this is a common control, it still maps to one or more controls in this desired framework, and we need to be able to do that mapping appropriately so that when an auditor comes in, they don't just go, well, you're not really meeting the spirit here. So the other issue that we run into here is most of these controls are not prescriptive. They tell you what you need to do, but not how to do it. So you end up this kind of like gray strategy versus black and white tactics approach here. We need to get down to the point where we're able to say, this is how we comply with this particular control in this framework. Because if an auditor's coming in, we have to be able to demonstrate that. So, secure controls framework, the big benefits here is we can easily move from one version of a framework to the next when that new version of the framework is released. So last year we went from ISO 27001, the 2013 version, to the 2022 version. We can also, when new frameworks are introduced, we can easily incorporate them into our environment. Right now we're talking ISO 27001, but if that SOC 2 thing comes into question or a customer says, how close are you to complying with NIST CSF, we can very easily show how well we're doing that. So I kind of mentioned this earlier, but this is the SCF. If you go to SCF-download at that URL that I gave you, you can download this spreadsheet. And the challenge of working with a spreadsheet, well, I mean, you guys know, the spreadsheets kind of suck. There's not a lot that you can do there, but it is, in the spreadsheet format, it's it's powerful. It's got the mappings for you. The challenge is when you start to look at governance, risk, and compliance, the spreadsheet only gets you so far. I can't share a spreadsheet. It's hard to like mutually edit a spreadsheet. There's all sorts of challenges there. So what we did in Simplerisk is we basically took the spreadsheet and we imported into Simplerisk. And so Simplerisk is free. It's open source, all the governance, the risk, the compliance. So you can go to simplerisk.com/download. You can download it, and everything that we talk about today, you can do for free. So I'm not pitching the product or anything like that. I'm just telling you guys, this is a little bit easier. So when you register your Simplerisk instance, I go through, I do that, and then I can enable SCF. And it's literally just click and activate button. And I spent a lot of time doing this, where I did the mappings in the SCF. I figured out how to import the spreadsheet that they give you into JSON data. I figured out how to pull that data into the Simplerisk system. So you don't have to deal with any of this stuff. You literally get a list of all the frameworks that are in the SCF. You select the ones that apply to your organization, click the little over button, and boom, they're all enabled in Simplerisk. So it makes this process a lot easier to be able to work with these. And in this picture, I've enabled my SOC 2 controls, the points of focus, and ISO 27001. And it's that easy. So if you want to perform a maturity assessment, just a basis of comparison, if you want to do this in the SCF spreadsheet, you need to go to the frameworks that you want, hide all the other frameworks that you don't care about, and then the frameworks that you want, you basically go and you select, I don't want anything that's blank, because if it's blank, that means that there are no controls associated with that particular common control, and you don't want to see those. You only want to see the ones that are associated with that. And so that's going to hide basically all the rows in this spreadsheet that are for controls that don't apply to whatever framework you're looking at. And then in terms of columns, you basically just hide all the columns that aren't the control question, the SPCMM levels, which is maturity stuff, and you end up essentially with your list of the controls and the questions and the maturity levels that apply to your specific framework. Doesn't matter which framework, we're doing ISO, you're doing SOC 2, he's doing CIS, it doesn't matter. And then we get to this point where we can start to do a maturity assessment. So traditionally, we think of controls as binary. A control's pass, it's a fail. We get a green light or a red light, right? That's the typical mentality when it comes to audit work. Realistically, our controls have varying levels of maturity. So it's really important when you're kind of going through these exercises not to understand whether you're passing or you're failing a specific control, but how well you're doing. And so these maturity values are going to tell us how well we're doing. So if I look at this particular question, this is around that same control that I showed you earlier, the common control. It says, does the organization staff a function to centrally govern cybersecurity and data privacy controls? And then we have each of the different maturity levels. In this case, I'm looking at not performed, and it says there's no evidence of a capability to facilitate the implementation of cybersecurity and data privacy governance controls. It's pretty simple. It says either you do this or you don't. It's still as black and white as the pass-fail, but as you move up the layers of maturity, you're going to see that there are, it's not just do I do it, do I not, it's how well do I do it. So next, Alan is going to talk a little bit about analyzing the results of this maturity assessment.
Josh. So as I said in my introduction, this way, okay. As I said in my introduction, my first day at Simplerisk was April 3rd of this year. I completed this assessment for ISO 27001 April 25th. And that includes the learning curve and starting with a new company and all the stuff that goes with that. As you can see from the results, right, so anything that was less than a managed maturity automatically produced a risk, which was considered a gap. So once I completed that piece of it, I then analyzed the control gaps through both interviewing Josh, sitting down with our DevSecOps folks, and sitting down with our support folks. The light blue is on the diagram is the current maturity. The dark blue is the desired. There's an old audit saying that if it's not documented, you're not doing it. Having done dozens of assessments in my career, I was pleasantly surprised how much we actually were doing, but just needed to document our practices. Incidentally, I first used the CMM, Carnegie Mellon Maturity Scale, in 1998. And I liked it so much, I tried to implement it at home. And that's how that fight started. So didn't go over too well. I tried it with both wives, and neither one of them liked it. Go figure. So during my career, having done most documentation manually, or editing a canned documentation from a provided source, Security Policies 101 used to come on the CDs. It's pretty painful. And that's the one thing I was kind of worried about with taking this job, was I knew pretty much intuitively how much documentation was going to be required, small company and everything else. And it can take forever, not to mention the brain drain, to manually create all the documentation required for any regulatory effort. So ChatGPT to the rescue, and I could finally use my plagiarizing skills for good use legally. So I don't totally get this. Josh actually had to show me the video, but your classic lions and tigers and bears, oh my, well, policy, procedures, and processes with ChatGPT, and then there's Sulu, oh my. So went to ChatGPT, which I had not used previously. I'd heard of it from seeing a South Park episode, actually. And Josh is like, hey, you need to try this out. It works really well. You just, type in what you want and it spits back an answer. So I did that. As you can see, very simple, write an ISO 27001 compliant policy for information security and awareness training. The result I got back, and this is the first slide of many, okay, is an enormous amount of output, sorry. Having done a lot of documentation over the years, written books and that kind of thing, I was amazed at how it was such a mostly consistent voice and tone throughout whatever I asked. And I used ChatGPT to write policies, write procedures. I even asked it to give me a process that I could then put into a process flow and a diagram. And the verbiage was also very consistent on the output across all of the requests. Naturally, just like with any policy template, some editing may be required specific to the nuances of your company and your culture. You can ask ChatGPT to reword entire sentences and paragraphs. So what they give you, like on this slide here, and you don't like the language, say reword it. And you can even reword it in other people's tones of voice, like Trump, for example. So you get a lot of marvelouses and a lot of fantastics and that kind of thing.
This is the most amazing policy. This is
Yes.
the best policy ever. You all will love this policy.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. And by the way, we're still on the same output from the original request, right? While each of these has been a high-level answer, right, it's because our request was very high-level. If we asked for additional detail, the request would have been provided in more detail, which you'll see here in a second when we get into the audit tests. So lastly, we get an approval page with different sections to fill in. It's really just an incredibly straightforward and much easier than creating from scratch in a blank mind. There's pros and cons to ChatGPT, like there's pros and cons to anything else, right? Besides what's listed on the screen, one of the things that I noticed, even though I already said that it was a fairly consistent voice, and I've said mostly consistent, I did notice that on certain days, and I couldn't tell you it was Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or Tuesday and Thursday, but using it day in and day out to create all this stuff, sometimes the content did change, sometimes the formatting changed, and I couldn't tell you why. It was always the same on any given day, but on different days, different weeks, it was a little bit different. So something to kind of look out for if you're wanting to have the output just 100% consistent in your own documentation. Obviously, the major con is that, probably would have been 5 of me trying to do all this, and with AI and ChatGPT doing stuff like this for us, then what am I going to do in my spare time? Quit our jobs, right? Like I mentioned earlier, pictures worth 1,000 words, and I told ChatGPT because there is a paid-for option where it'll create a diagram for you, but again, it's a paid-for option. And so I said, hey, write me a process flow for an SDLC, because I wanted to just have something that I could put into a diagram and then run it by Josh and go, okay, here's what I think we're doing, let's correct it, which there's several versions, by the way. I've been using Visio since 1998. The last time I touched Draw.io, which is what this diagram was done in, was about 10 years ago, and it was just impossible. It was too different. I couldn't get my brain around all of the nuances. So fast forward 10 years later, it's exactly like Visio. I don't know whether the copyright expired or what, but it has all the same functionality, and it's a much better price tag because now it's free. Draw.io is. So I'm done with the documentation, right? So where do I put it? Within Simple Risk, the free version, there is a document management module to it, right? And so having gone through, worked with most of the larger GRC, well-known GRC platforms that aren't open source, anytime you, across within 4 different companies, anytime you want to make just a slight change to your policies, guidelines, so on and so forth, it's about 4 to 6 weeks of development time, and message boards and everything else. It's just an enormous amount of work. With the way that we've done it here at Simple Risk, you make changes to the document, policy procedure standard, you just make changes in Word or whatever, and then upload it again. And you can see from the screen here that there's several different areas. It's like the metadata for the document. So the difference between 2701 and 2702. Initially, it was a little confusing. It was me and Josh's second debate. The first one being, should we do SOC 2 or should we do ISO? I won that debate. This one he won because I went down the path, having been a PCI auditor, right, and just love all those controls. I accidentally went down the path of focusing first on 27002 and doing that assessment. And Josh was like, I know he's checking up on me or what, but he went and looked. He's like, Alan, there's 48 controls. Where are you getting all of this from? I'm like, I don't know, dude. I downloaded off the SCF within Simple Risk. This is what it gave me. Well, so coming to find out that 2701 is what your certification is actually based on. Now, I will tell you that having worked for a couple of companies that do SOC 2, your prospects and your customers will say, great, you're ISO, you're SOC 2 certified, awesome. Now let's talk about all the other controls that we still want you to have. This is kind of like a entry fee, if you will. The analogy I like to explain the difference to myself and others is that essentially 27001 is strategic, while 27002 is tactical in nature. As I mentioned a second ago, 48 common controls for 27001 and 308 for 27002, which was fortunate for me because I just get to focus on the 01 piece first. If you're all familiar with PCI, let's hope that nobody on the PCI Council ever goes to work for the equivalent of the 27001 Council, because then we're going to have 360 controls. Crawl, walk, run, right? We're starting out with 27001, and then in the future, midpoint of next year, once we get the actual certification, I'll start working on the 27002. In the meantime, so we got the documentation in place, and we've got the documented the controls and what we're doing and how we're doing it. So the next step is to figure out how do we validate that we're going to comply with these controls. When is a test? Isn't a test because you have all the answers already. So as we mentioned earlier, to an auditor, there's a marked difference between the SCF grayness and the actual audit language that ISO requires. And there's also multiple ISO controls for any given SCF control. So our testing is going to have to be precise compared to SCF's accuracy for the sake of the audit. So just like the ChatGPT policy, et cetera, creation, that I wrote, I used it again to actually write the control tests. Now, a little bit of a nuance. So ChatGPT 3.5 is a free version. It's knowledgeable up until I think it's January 2021, and it's very aware of the 2013 version of 27001. So all I had to do initially was just write this control number. Okay. However, we're using the 2022 version, which is not available in ChatGPT. We paid for the answers, the actual audit terminology for 27001, and so I had to reference that in the actual question that I posted to ChatGPT, the actual request. Which I'm not doing here because of their copyright. Just wanted to make that a reference point. So, more screens and screens of output. Regardless of the fact that I'm, being somewhat general, it still spits out a coherent, specific objective. And like the policy and the creation and everything else, you may still need to polish it with your own information. Did the same thing here, asking for actual tests, test scenarios. But but I've requested the components of the test. ISP equals information security policy. I need to validate my controls are functioning properly ourselves before the auditor even walks in the door. This is still the same output from the original request. It's just broken up between several slides, as I said. It's a ton of information. The outline breakdown is also phenomenal because I can easily document how we are complying and provide evidence, as you'll see shortly here on slide 63. So this is the last bit of information from the original request to write the objective and the test steps. The other part that's been amazing to me personally regarding ChatGPT is how complete the answers are from a human business perspective. Maybe it's just me, but I know I've forgotten to add sections like a conclusion when I create documentation manually, and ChatGPT just knows what to do. So this is a question that I posed is to find out, so that I could document what's the expected result of the output of the test objective, meaning what should the answer be that we already know. Answering this question, the expected result, make sure that our test scripts for each control objective knows what the answer is beforehand.
Any auditors in the room?
Used to be. And now Josh is going to talk about running the actual audit.
Thanks, Alan. You're doing pretty good for your first presentation. Yeah. So yeah, the next piece is just running the audit. And as Alan said, the really important thing here is that we found that there's not a one-to-one mapping between the SCF controls and the ISO controls. And so when it came to actually creating these tests, we had to create a single test essentially for each of the ISO controls, but those tests were multiple tests for the same common control. So we're still meeting the spirit of ISO. We're still able to demonstrate to an auditor that we comply with every single piece of ISO through our testing. But from the control framework perspective, we're looking at the broader picture so that we can do all those things that I talked about earlier, where we're able to associate this with other control frameworks and show how we comply with them. So the nice thing here is that, from our perspective, the constellations are visible, the planets are aligned, T's crossed, I's dotted, ducks are in a row, right? We're doing this so that when the auditor comes in, we can decrease their workload and therefore our workload, and decrease the number of billable hours for this audit, because ultimately it all comes down to money. We're trying to make this as efficient and as effective a process as possible. And so we go through and we run this audit. We put all the controls out there, and now we need to be able to report on it. We need to be able to show very succinct results. And so this is an example of our audit timeline report, where it's basically just going to show you, here's each of the different tests that we've generated. Here's the result of the test, when it was tested, and then we can go into here and we can kick off additional tests. We can view the past results. We can, whatever we want to do. The information is all here at our fingertips. Again, free, open source, whatever. So now when the auditor comes in, we can easily demonstrate the status of each of these tests that were performed. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about this AWS Swamp of Gold. We mentioned earlier, architecture, we're running AWS. I can almost guarantee you there's others in this room that are. And so I want to call out a few tools here to kind of talk through what we're doing, right? Because the next thing the auditor is going to ask for is evidence. They're going to want us to be able to prove that we have these operational controls in place. And this kind of leads to the ISO 27002 discussion that Alan had. There's going to be a significant learning curve if you're first getting started with AWS. There's a lot there. But the great thing here is these are all very robust tools. They're built for managing this kind of thing. And AWS is one of those organizations that eats their own dog food. They're using their own tools. And most of these are either free tools or they're charged based on scale. So if you're only using a couple things, it really shouldn't cost you a lot of money. The not so great things about all these super robust built-in tools is because they're free, some of the data analysis ends up being manual. You have to actually filter through the data. So Alan will come and he'll be like, here's all the vulnerabilities that were found by Inspector. And I'll be like, okay, now filter through that list and tell me the ones I actually care about. Right? So we need to make sure that we're kind of balancing the amounts of effort that are involved here. So real quick with these tools, Amazon Inspector We had a slide that was talking about that. Yeah, there we go. Amazon Inspector. So that's for vulnerability scanning. Amazon Inspector will basically go out, all of your EC2 instances that are out there, it's going to scan them and it's going to say, based on the versions of this software, here's the vulnerabilities that you have. So this is kind of used for like patch management, understanding what vulnerabilities are out there and things like that. The big challenge that you'll have with Amazon Inspector is that it's going to give you a lot of findings, and most of these findings are things that you couldn't fix without moving to a new version of the operating system, just to be honest with you. And so oftentimes the results, like we'll find some things in there, we're like, oh, we should probably fix that. But most of them are like, okay, well, when we upgrade to the next version of Ubuntu, we'll automatically take care of all these things. Security Hub is a security score across the AWS standards. So it's going to tell you how well you're doing based on these standards, and it's going to show you essentially a score for your organization. GuardDuty is awesome. If you are using AWS and you're not using GuardDuty, you are doing it wrong. GuardDuty is basically a snapshot of the findings, and it looks at the buckets, it looks at your RDS, it looks at all of your logs, everything. It looks at net flow traffic, and it says, here's stuff that you care about. And sometimes it's like, there's a bunch of scanning activity on your systems. Sometimes it's, hey, here's a very specific attack, but GuardDuty is great for that. And it's not crazy expensive to run GuardDuty either. CloudTrail is for logs, so that's essentially the SIEM platform that's built into AWS. So you get real-time monitoring of logs. And then CloudWatch is your alerting. That's going to be your alarms for things that are going bump in the night, our system is down or whatever. So you kind of take all these different things and you put them together and you start to work these into your audit. So when you have to demonstrate that you have a vulnerability management program, we use Inspector for our vulnerability scanning. And here's how we analyze the results. Here's the process that we use for vulnerability management. Now you can demonstrate that we're doing that. When it comes to having an IDS or an IPS control, you point to GuardDuty and say, look, GuardDuty is analyzing all this data, all the traffic, whatever. We use GuardDuty for this. So it ends up being a very cost-effective approach and a pretty streamlined approach to being able to do this in the AWS environment. Now, I'm not super familiar with Azure or GCP, but I'm pretty certain that they have very similar tools in those environments. So Alan, how do we bring it home? No, that's a serious question. How do we bring this home, Alan?
Well, the way we bring it home is next step is we need to find an auditor that'll give us what we want. I've been, over the last 6 months since I started work for Simple Risk, I've been kind of compiling a list of what we wanted an auditor. Bringing the future spouse home to mom and dad, because as you all know that have been audited, right, it's a very close relationship with the auditor because he gets to see almost everything. First off the bat, we want a local resource in Austin. It'll obviously decrease costs, and we won't have all of the travel expenses. Secondly, they've got to have some familiarity with AWS. Getting a seasoned auditor that's still familiar with client server and can't spell AWS, that'll be a real problem. They've got to be adept at auditing CI/CD. They've got to understand it. I don't want to be teaching the auditor what CI/CD is as part of the audit, because again, that's just going to be more billable hours for him. They need to have previous experience certifying small companies for ISO. We will have an enormous number of problems if the ISO auditor that we get is only familiar with the Fortune 50 and Fortune 20 companies out there that they've previously done audits for. They're not going to even understand the concept of, what do you mean you only have 12 employees? How are you getting all of this done, right? By the way, we get all done because we have everything on AWS. And lastly, they've got to have some familiarity with it with the SCF. And this one I'm willing to be flexible on. I don't know how pervasive it is. I know I had never heard of it before, but having an understanding of how the SCF works and how we're using it, and already having familiarity with it, it'll make it easier to explain how we've done the audit tests. And I'm from Texas, as you saw, born and raised in Houston, went to UT. But I've lived the last 10 years in Colorado, so when in Rome, right? As I'm now a CU Buffaloes fan as well. I've got two teams. As Neon Dion, Coach Prime Sanders says, we're ready. However, this is also how the audit might go.
So yeah, we are ready for the audit. We feel good about it. We're targeting Q1 of next year. And this was, like Alan said, he was hired 6 months ago. So a very short time to get us ready to this point. But it's always going to be a learning experience. We're constantly going to be improving upon this. We're going to have to go back and get recertified. And we know that going into it. So with that, I think we're done with the presentation. Ooh. So the question is, are we going to be back next year?
I will tell you that if we're not, I probably won't be standing next to him.
Good luck, Alan. Awesome. Thank you guys for your time. We appreciate
Thank
it.
you.